Much. Andrew, you already voiced your doubts whether NATO should focus more on a shorter list of priorities. You asked the question what NATO should not do. If we get a shorter list of what NATO should do, would the list be the same in the US and in Europe? Andrew.
Thank you very much. Again, Evgeniusz, thank you for a terrific conference and for inviting me to speak here. And since you started me off, Janusz, with a question, let me answer it in the following way, and it will tie a bit to what Robin was saying as well. It seems to me that we're working at cross purposes right now. This is not an alliance that is at a risk of imploding, but it is clearly out of balance, it seems to me, for some of the reasons that we have already heard discussed in this room. There are different security optics in terms of the scope where this alliance ought to operate. Robin mentioned that the European perspective is more regionally bound, is more circumscribed in this kind of continental and nearer optics, if you will. My country right now, which is engaged in a very difficult series of operations, of necessity, by definition, looks to more of an expeditionary posture, the term that's been bandied about. But I would argue there's more to that than simply the current operations, and I would encourage our group to think of those divergent optics beyond the current operation in Afghanistan and ask a question: what is the quote-unquote security neighborhood that the United States lives in, which is a global security neighborhood, and what is the European security neighborhood, which I would submit to you, until ESDP gets fuller legs, so to speak, is still a regional, more regionally oriented neighborhood. And I think Minister Sikorski here articulated what is the regional perspective from Central Europe, which is the more of a, for lack of a better word, quid pro quo vision. Central Europe tends to hew closer to the American optic on the current operations, in part because the historic memory of the regional experience to these is that much more vivid in the region. So there is a tendency of doing more in order to revitalize NATO, to protect it, with the anticipation that the United States will reciprocate if the need might arise. When I say we're out of balance, I say, these different optics have to be reconciled somehow. And it seems to me that it's already been hinted at in this room when Janusz Onyszkiewicz raised the issue of military responses being widened to be able to not only focus on strictly military responses, but actually looking at Article 5 as covering threats and dealing with them in that way. Jim Goldgeier recently wrote a piece for the Council on Foreign Relations where he actually argued that the either-or dichotomy, territorial defense versus expeditionary, is actually a false dichotomy, and that we should look at Article 5 in those defense categories, broadly speaking, and talk of them as together with rather than either-or. And that will start bridging some of those differences that we now have between the West European, Central European, and American optics. The second point I want to make, and I keep emphasizing why this is so important to me, to get narrower consensus on what we are about, is that if we keep multiplying tasks, NATO is at a risk of becoming a dumping ground for virtually any security-related task. We keep going too far, almost like in the field of security studies, and begin to talk about what tasks NATO can perform in relation to, say, fighting climate change and things of that nature, which to me is a bridge too far. I think that the alliance that's trying to do everything will not be able to do core tasks well, and I hope that in the process of debating the strategic concept, we will get a better sense of what those core tasks are. And I think we can agree in terms of what the principal threats are and drive our mission accordingly. I mean, alliances in the final analysis are about shared threats, and everything else is derivative. So structuring and norm-setting functions come secondary here. So I would encourage, as we debate these issues, I would encourage us to focus on the core threats that we can agree to look at. That brings me to the most important point in all of this, it seems to me. We live in a very resource-constrained environment today. My country is pursuing two campaigns, one that we're winding down in Iraq, the other one that we're trying to bring to a successful conclusion with the surge in Afghanistan. The president has a very ambitious domestic policy agenda. We also have serious deficits and debt issues to contend with. In a nutshell, I would say a country that, like mine, is now leveraged to a large extent will, by definition, look to limit the cost of those operations and ask the allies to contribute more. You may criticize us for being selfish, but I think if we move beyond that and look at the resources that are being committed, there is something to the American argument that only 5 of the NATO members spend at or above the symbolic 2% of GDP. Now, it doesn't mean that Europe is supposed to contribute more so that we can pursue our security objectives. I'm not advocating that at all. What I'm advocating is that we start talking in terms of what Secretary Clinton said at the last Strategic Concept Seminar in Washington. That is leadership, i.e. political will of the governments to actually explain to the publics why it is that we should, in this difficult time, spend more on defense. And I think this is critical because we can write our strategic concepts in the most beautiful language and articulate the most sophisticated terms on which we would act. But if we don't have the will to fund these operations, then all of this, quite frankly, and I apologize for being blunt, will not be worth the paper it's written on. We need to actually talk amongst ourselves about what the challenges are that we can all come close to. There probably will not be unanimity today. As Klaus pointed out, the kind of threat we had in the Cold War era that unified us will probably not reappear anytime soon. But we can agree on a range of issues that constitute a threat to all of us, collectively speaking, and then try to divide the tasks accordingly, provided that we're willing to fund what we want to do. I think there's a lot that unifies us as a transatlantic community today, even though we may be in need of counseling after the last 8 years that were pretty difficult in transatlantic relations. But I think, again, the discussion that we're in today, talking about what the goals of this alliance should be, could start this conversation going in the positive direction. I would like to have us address the issue of what it is that constitutes the core business of this alliance, and as you probably gauged from my question to the Secretary General, what it is that should not be the business of this alliance, and in fact should be handed over to our partners in the European Union, to other organizations like the UN, to NGOs. I mean, if the alliance is to be successful, I think we need to think in those terms. So to summarize, I would say we need to rebalance our perceptions of what constitutes a threat, not only in terms of the kind of statements we generate at every summit, but something that the governments are willing to throw their weight behind. Secondly, communicate to the public. There is a risk, and I see this in the United States, of NATO disappearing from the public sphere, so to speak, of the American public thinking of Afghanistan predominantly as an American war and not seeing the contributions that the allies are making. I think that's corrosive, and I think there's a lot of responsibility to go around on this. But most of all, resources, resources, and resources. I think without a real commitment to fund the obligations that we undertake, we are at a risk of enlarging this political dimension of the alliance, making commitments, i.e. writing checks we can't really pay for, and in the end, diluting the organization and making it into a shell that will continue but will not really deliver security where needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew.